The air in my father's apartment was thick with the smell of dust and disuse. I kicked a stack of old magazines, sending a puff of gray into a sunbeam. "God damn it," I muttered to the empty room. The flight here, the rental car, now this, sorting through a life I'd barely been a part of for the last decade. A film of grime covered every surface. I ran a finger over the kitchen counter and looked at the smear of brown on my skin. Disgusting. My job today was the books. My father had hundreds. Most were worthless paperbacks with cracked spines, their pages yellow and brittle. I worked with a grim efficiency, tossing them into a heavy-duty trash bag. Each thump in the bag felt like a small, final punctuation mark. My back ached. My resentment was a low hum beneath the surface, a constant companion to the guilt chewing at my insides. I should have called more. I should have visited. Now, all that was left was his junk. I reached a section of hardcovers on a low shelf. Tucked among them was a familiar sight. A dark, leather-bound copy of Moby Dick. His favorite. He used to read it to me, his voice a low rumble, the smell of his pipe tobacco filling the room. I picked it up. The leather was worn smooth in places. I hesitated, then tossed it onto the small desk by the window, separating it from the garbage. A keeper. My throat was dry. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a glass from the dish rack and ran the tap. The water came out in a sputtering cough before flowing clear. As I drank, my eyes landed on the kitchen counter. A cluster of metal. My keys. The keys to this apartment, which I had hung on the hook by the door when I came in. I was sure of it. I always hang my keys up. A small knot of confusion tightened in my gut. I must have just dropped them there without thinking when I walked in. I finished the water, the coolness doing little to settle me. I shook my head, dismissing it. I was tired. That's all. I went back to the living room, back to the desk. I reached for the book. My hand stopped. It wasn't leather, it was a hardcover. Bright blue. The title, Moby Dick, was stamped on the spine in plain gold font. I picked it up. The texture was cloth-bound, rough, under my fingertips. This wasn't my father's book. I knew his book. I had held it 1,000 times as a boy. I had just held it 60 seconds ago. My mind raced, trying to find a logical path. Did I pick up the wrong one? I looked back at the shelf. Only a dusty, empty space remained. There was no other copy. This couldn't be a mistake of memory. The difference was too stark. The visceral feeling of the worn leather was gone, replaced by this cheap, stiff fabric. I stood there, holding the book, the weight of it feeling alien in my hand. The low hum of resentment was gone, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. I slowly scanned the room. The familiar clutter of my father's life suddenly seemed like a collection of props on a stage, and someone had just switched one out. That was it. I was done for the day. My brain was playing tricks on me. Grief, stress, whatever. I needed to get out. I walked to the front door, my steps feeling heavy on the worn carpet. I grabbed the doorknob and turned. It didn't budge. I turned it again, putting my shoulder into it. The mechanism didn't even click. It was solid, as if the knob and the lock were a single piece of fused metal. A surge of adrenaline hit me, hot and sharp. I jiggled the knob. I rattled it, the sound loud in the apartment. Nothing. I hammered on the wood with my fist. "Hey!" My voice sounded thin. "Fine." A jammed lock. Old building, old door. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I'd call a locksmith. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't see my apps. There was no home screen. Just a fizzing screen of shifting black and white lines, like a television tuned to a dead channel. And in the center, a single, stark white number. 1. No signal bars. No battery icon. Just the static and the number. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My connection to the world was gone. The apartment was no longer just a mess to be cleaned. It was a box. And I was inside it. A sound. From my father's bedroom. A soft click-clack, like a loose piece of plastic tapping against a wooden floor. My breath caught in my throat. My heart started a frantic, painful rhythm against my ribs. I was supposed to be alone. I backed away from the door, my eyes fixed on the dark opening of the hallway that led to the bedroom. Every nerve ending screamed. I couldn't make a sound. My only thought was to hide. The large, overstuffed sofa in the middle of the room offered the only real cover. I dropped to my knees, the impact jarring my bones, and crawled behind it. I pressed my body against the rough fabric, pulling my legs in tight. Then came the footsteps. A slow, dragging shuffle. One foot, then a long pause, then the other. It wasn't the sound of a person walking, it was the sound of something being pulled across the floor. The shuffling emerged from the hallway and into the living room. I risked a look, peering through the small gap between the back of the sofa and the cushion. A figure stood in the center of the room. It was tall, impossibly thin. Its limbs were long, held at odd angles. It wore what looked like my father's old clothes, but they hung off its frame, empty and loose. I couldn't see a face, just a downward tilted head, a mop of dark, matted hair obscuring any features. It stood perfectly still for a moment, its head slowly sweeping from side to side, as if scanning the room. The air grew colder. I could smell something now, sharp and clean like the air after a lightning strike, mixed with the musty odor of old paper. It began to move again, shuffling towards me. Towards the sofa. I squeezed my eyes shut, my teeth clamped together so hard my jaw ached. I could hear the shuff of its feet on the carpet, getting closer. It was a dry, rasping sound. It passed by my hiding spot. It was so close I could have reached out and touched the loose fabric of its trousers. The smell of ozone and dust was overwhelming. I held my breath until my lungs burned, my entire body rigid. I waited for a hand to fall on my shoulder. For a voice. For anything. But it just kept shuffling past. I heard it move into the kitchen. There was a sound of a cabinet door opening, then closing with a soft click. Then, nothing. The sound stopped. The shuffling was gone. I stayed behind the sofa, coiled like a spring, for a long time. My muscles screamed in protest. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. Finally, shaking, I pushed myself up. My legs were numb. I looked around the empty room. It was exactly as it had been. I staggered to the kitchen. Empty. The door. I ran to it, not caring about the noise. I grabbed the knob, expecting it to be locked fast. It turned. The latch clicked open with a smooth, effortless motion. I didn't wait. I threw the door open and stumbled out into the hallway, not looking back. I slammed my fist on the elevator button, once, twice, a third time. The doors slid open with a tired groan. I stepped inside, my back pressed against the far wall, my eyes locked on the open door of my father's apartment. As the elevator doors began to close, a final detail registered in my brain, a detail that made the blood freeze in my veins. The chumchiakoa, my keys, the ones I had seen on the kitchen counter, were no longer inside. They were hanging from the lock, on the outside of the door, dangling a gentle, mocking welcome. The drive back was a conversation I had with myself, a series of logical statements meant to stitch the torn fabric of the day before. The lock was old. It jammed. I was tired and dehydrated, seeing things. The phone screen was a glitch, a temporary crash. The sounds, the figure. That was grief. A waking nightmare brought on by stress and a guilty conscience. By the time I parked the rental car, the morning sun felt like a sterile, cleansing light. I had convinced myself. I had to finish the job. I walked up the building's front steps. The air was cool and smelled of car exhaust and damp concrete. I unlocked the apartment door. It opened smoothly. I stepped inside. The air was stale, unchanged. I left the door open a few inches, a small concession to the knot of tension still lodged behind my ribs. Today I would be methodical. I would be efficient. I would not let this place get to me. To prove it, I pulled out my phone and called Amy. I needed to hear a voice from outside these walls. It rang twice. "Hey, you," she said. Her voice was a tether to the real world. "Hey, just checking in." I walked into the living room, cradling the phone between my shoulder and ear. I picked up an empty trash bag. "How's your morning?" "Fine. Boring. All the excitement is on your end, apparently. How's the mausoleum?" "Smells like it," I said, starting to toss old newspapers into the bag. The crinkle of the paper was loud. "Just so much stuff. I don't know why he kept all this." You doing okay? Her voice softened. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired. Didn't sleep great. An understatement. I'd stared at the ceiling of my cheap motel room until it started to get light outside. I just want to get this done and get home. I know. Just take your time. Don't push it. My eyes scanned the room, landing on a dark wooden cabinet in the corner. On top of it, coated in a layer of dust, was a single, silver-plated picture frame. I walked over to it. My conversation with Amy, a low murmur in my ear. I picked it up. A family photo. It was from a trip to the beach a lifetime ago. Me, a scrawny kid with a gap-toothed grin. My mother, her hair tied back in a scarf, looking happy, genuinely happy. And my father, his arm around her, a rare, unforced smile on his face. The sun was bright. I remembered the feeling of the hot sand. It was one of the good days. You still there? Amy's voice cut through the memory. Yeah, sorry. Just found an old picture. I set the frame down on the small desk by the window, intending to clean it later. A keeper. Listen, I should probably get to it. I'll call you when I'm done for the day. Okay, call me if you need anything. I love you. Love you too, I said and hung up. The silence of the apartment rushed back in. The friendly murmur was gone, replaced by the low hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, the phone feeling heavy in my hand. I looked at the desk. The dust on its surface was disturbed where I had set the frame down. I picked it up again to wipe the glass with my sleeve. I stopped. My hand froze. The photograph was the same. It was the beach. The sun was bright. I was there, the same skinny kid. My mother was there, the same scarf in her hair. But the man with his arm around her was not my father. My blood went cold. I brought the frame closer to my face. This man was a stranger. He was similar in build, wearing a similar shirt, but his face was all wrong. The smile was too wide. A stretched, unnatural curve of teeth. His eyes weren't looking at the camera. They seemed to stare at a point somewhere over the photographer's shoulder, and they held no light. They were just dark shapes. This wasn't a faded print. This wasn't a trick of the light. It was a different person. A replacement. No, I whispered. My voice was a dry croak. No fucking way. I dropped the frame on the desk. It landed with a clatter. It had to be a mistake. A different photo from the same trip? Another relative I didn't remember? My heart hammered against my ribs, a fast, frantic drumbeat. I needed to see more. I lunged for the dark wooden cabinet, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the small brass knob. I pulled the door open. Inside were stacks of old, heavy photo albums. I grabbed the top one, its cheap plastic cover cracking in my grip, and threw it onto the floor. I knelt, my knees hitting the worn carpet hard, and ripped it open. The first page. My first birthday. Me in a high chair, covered in cake. My mother laughing. My father stood behind her, a party hat perched on his head. Except it wasn't him. It was the man from the beach photo. The same wide smile. The same dead stare. I flipped the page, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. A Christmas. The tree lit up behind us. The man was there, handing me a gift. A Thanksgiving dinner. The man was at the head of the table, carving a turkey. Page after page, a life story of a family I didn't recognize, starring me, my mother, and this imposter. A frantic desperation took over. I pulled the other albums from the cabinet, throwing them down, tearing through them. They were all the same. Every picture that should have had my father in it now featured this stranger. It was in the middle of this frantic search that every light in the apartment flickered once, twice, and then died. The room was plunged into a deep, gray twilight. The sun was setting outside, its weak light barely filtering through the dirty windows. My heart seized. I was on my hands and knees in the near dark, surrounded by corrupted memories. I scrambled for my phone, my fingers finding it on the floor where I'd dropped it. I swiped up, and the flashlight clicked on, a single, narrow beam cutting through the gloom. It felt pitifully small. I aimed it around the room. The familiar clutter became monstrous shapes in the moving shadows. Then came a new sound. A low, electric hum. It came from the corner of the living room. I swung the flashlight beam towards it. An old, dust-covered radio sat on a small end table. I hadn't even noticed it was plugged in. A red power light glowed faintly. It wasn't tuned to a station. There was only static. A thick, hissing sound, and then, through the hiss, a voice. It was distorted, a low-pitched, burbling sound, like a recording being played at the wrong speed. It spoke a single word, over and over again, in a broken, looping rhythm. Wrong, wrong, wrong. The beam of my flashlight trembled in my hand. My breath hitched. I pushed myself backwards on the floor, my palms scraping against the carpet, away from the cabinet, away from the sound. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Suddenly, a violent bang erupted from the cabinet in front of me. I flinched so hard my teeth clicked together. I jerked the flashlight beam back towards it. One of the deep lower drawers had shot open, hitting its stops with a sound like a gunshot. A cloud of loose photographs burst from it, fluttering down to the floor like dead leaves. My light caught it for less than a second. A flash of movement. Something retracting from the lip of the open drawer, pulling back into the dark space underneath the cabinet. It was a hand. It was long and gray. The fingers were like twigs, thin and bony. It vanished into the shadows before my mind could fully process what I'd seen. Something inside me snapped. The fear didn't vanish, but it was consumed by a hot, boiling rage. I wasn't going to hide behind the sofa this time. I wasn't going to be a rat in a box. My eyes darted around the room, the flashlight beam slashing wildly. It fell upon the fireplace. A set of iron tools rested on the hearth. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the poker, a solid, heavy rod of black iron, and turned back to the cabinet. Get out! The scream tore from my throat, raw and loud in the enclosed space. The radio hissed. Wrong. Wrong. I stalked forward, the iron poker gripped in both hands like a bat. I wasn't thinking, I was just acting. I reached the cabinet, raised the poker high over my head, and brought it down with all my strength into the dark opening beneath the open drawer. The impact was immense. A deafening crack of splintering wood echoed through the apartment. The poker shuddered in my hands, a painful vibration shooting up my arms to my shoulders. I screamed again, a wordless sound of fury, and struck it a second time, and a third. I hammered at the space where I'd seen the hand, splintering the cheap pressboard, the poker thudding and cracking against the frame. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The radio clicked off, the hissing stopped, and the lights came back on. The overhead fixture blazed to life, flooding the room with a flat yellow light. I stood there, panting, the heavy poker hanging limp in my hand. My arms ached. My knuckles were white. The room was silent except for my own ragged breathing. I looked down. The area under the cabinet was a wreck of splintered wood. There was nothing inside but dust bunnies and darkness. The floor around me was littered with the spilled photographs. I let the poker fall. It hit the carpet with a soft thud. I bent down and picked one up. It was a picture of me on a swing set. The man with the too wide smile was pushing me from behind. I picked up another. A picnic in a park. He was there, sitting on a blanket next to my mother. Every single one. Every memory I had, visually erased and defiled. I felt a crippling wave of defeat wash over me. I stood up, my body feeling heavy and weak. My eyes fell on the desk, on the first photo I had found. The silver-framed picture from the beach. I walked over to it. It was still there, the skinny kid. My mother. The strange man. But something new had been added. A thin, hair-like fracture ran across the surface of the glass. It started at the top edge of the frame and snaked its way down. It passed directly through the smiling, gapped-toothed face of the boy in the picture. It passed directly through my face. My breath sawed in and out of my lungs, a harsh, scraping sound in the sudden quiet. The overhead light was aggressive, a flat yellow glare that flattened the shadows and exposed every detail of the chaos I had created. Splinters of wood. Scattered photographs. The iron poker lay on the worn carpet, a heavy black line against the faded pattern. My arms trembled from the effort, a deep ache settling into the bone. My gaze was fixed on the desk. On the cracked glass of the silver frame, the fracture line was a spiderweb of black, a subtle flaw that had bisected my own childhood image. It was a violation. Not loud, not violent like the splintered cabinet, but a quiet, surgical cut into the past. A cold certainty settled in my gut, displacing the hot rage. This was not grief. This was not my mind playing tricks. This place was sick. The things in it were sick. And I was not leaving until I understood. Logic was the only weapon I had left. I needed a baseline. I needed evidence that couldn't be argued away by a tired mind. My phone. I had dropped it. I saw it lying screen down near the photo albums. I picked it up, my hand shaking so much I almost dropped it again. The screen was fine. I swiped it open, my thumb clumsy on the glass. The camera. I needed to document everything, to create a fixed record of reality as it was in this exact moment. I pointed the phone at the corner of the room. A tall grandfather clock stood there, a dark, silent sentinel my father had cherished. It hadn't worked in years. I centered it in the frame, the lens focusing on the ornate carvings in the wood, the brass Roman numerals on its face, the heavy, motionless pendulum hanging behind the glass door, a thick brass disc. I held my breath and pressed the shutter button. The flash was a startling white crack in the yellow room, followed by the electronic click. One picture, one piece of solid ground. I stood there for a second, the phone in my hand feeling like a talisman. It wasn't enough. The feeling of the iron poker in my hand, the satisfying thud of it sinking into wood had been good. But if whatever was in this apartment could hide in the shadows, I needed something I could keep with me. Something sharp. I walked to the kitchen. My shoes felt loud on the linoleum floor. The air in here was different, tinged with the faint, sour smell of an old refrigerator. I pulled open the top drawer to the left of the sink. A clatter of metal on metal. Forks, spoons, a bottle opener, a corkscrew. Not what I wanted. I slammed it shut and pulled open the one below it. The butcher block knife holder was there, lying on its side. I tipped it up. A row of knives, from a small paring knife to a large cleaver. I reached for the chef's knife. The handle was black, synthetic, worn smooth from use. The blade was 8 inches of stainless steel. I pulled it free. It felt heavy, solid, real. The light from the kitchen window glinted off the sharpened edge. I held it tight, my knuckles white, and walked back into the living room. The knife made me feel a little less like prey. The cold steel was a comfort. I was not just a terrified man in a dead man's apartment. I was armed. I could fight back. My eyes went immediately to the grandfather clock. It stood exactly as it had a few minutes before. Silent. Unchanged. The dark wood, the brass face, the motionless pendulum. A breath I didn't know I was holding escaped my lips in a long, slow sigh. Maybe I had won the last round. Maybe the violence had worked. Maybe it was gone. But I had my proof, to be sure. I raised the phone, my other hand still gripping the knife. I swiped to the photo gallery. The most recent image appeared. My heart stopped. It didn't beat. It didn't flutter. It just stopped. All the air left my body. The picture on my screen was of the grandfather clock. The wood was the same. The face was the same. But the pendulum was not. In the photograph I had taken less than 5 minutes ago, the pendulum was a disc of polished silver, not brass. It gleamed with a cold, white light in the phone's flash. I looked from the silver pendulum on the screen to the brass pendulum in the clock, then back to the silver, then back to the brass. My mind refused to connect the two images. It was impossible. I took the picture, I saw the brass pendulum, I remembered seeing it. But the photograph, the unchangeable digital record I had just created, said I was wrong. It told me my own memory was a lie. The proof I had created to anchor myself to reality had been poisoned. It changed what was to match what is. A wave of nausea washed over me. The knife felt useless. How do you stab a thing that can edit your memory? BS. Blavermanflight. The only sane response. Get out. Don't think. Don't look at anything else. Just get out. I dropped the phone. It hit the carpet with a soft thud. I didn't care. I bolted for the entryway, the knife clutched in a death grip. 1 step. 2 steps. My hand reached out for the doorknob, my mind already picturing the hallway, the stairs, the street outside. My fingers didn't find a cold, metal knob. They slapped against something rough, something hard and gritty. Brick. I jerked my hand back as if burned. I stared. The door was gone. The white painted frame was gone. In its place was a solid wall of old, faded red brick, streaked with grime and spiderwebbed with crumbling mortar. It was not an illusion. It was solid. Real. I reached out again, slowly, my fingers trembling. I touched the surface. It was cold and rough. I knocked my knuckles against it. A dull, solid thud. A wall. It had always been a wall. There had never been a door here. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat. I spun around, my back pressing against the impossible brickwork. I looked down the short hallway that led back to the living room. It wasn't a short hallway anymore. It stretched away from me, plunging into a deep, consuming darkness far beyond the confines of the apartment. The walls seemed to sweat, glistening faintly in the light from the living room behind me. The cheap floral wallpaper was peeling, revealing dark, wet-looking stains beneath. The doors to the other apartments, 3A and 3C, were still there, but they looked wrong. Warped. The wood was darker. The brass numbers on them were twisted, misshapen, like melting wax. The familiar hallway had become a throat, and I was deep inside it. There was no exit. Not in front of me, not behind me. And from the deepest dark, at the far end of the impossible distance, a sound began. It was thin. A child's voice, singing a nursery rhyme I couldn't quite place. The tune was disjointed, rising and falling at the wrong times, a broken melody that scraped at the edges of my hearing. La la la, down the stream. The voice was getting closer, not like someone was walking, but as if the sound itself was just appearing nearer, point by point, down the endless corridor. Cold terror, pure and absolute, seized me. The knife in my hand was a child's toy. My legs felt like lead. Merrily, merrily, life is but a dream. I turned and ran, away from the voice, away from the brick wall. I ran down the throat of the hallway, deeper into the apartment that was no longer an apartment. My feet pounded on a floor that was no longer carpet, but bare, creaking wood. The light from the living room behind me dwindled to a pinprick and then vanished. I was running in total darkness. I couldn't see anything. I ran with my hands out in front of me, expecting to hit a wall at any second, but there was no wall. The hallway just went on. Row, row, row your boat. The voice was right behind me now. I could feel it on the back of my neck, a cold whisper that wasn't carried by air. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, a stitch of pure agony tearing at my side. My muscles screamed. I stumbled. My foot caught on an unseen obstacle, and I went down hard, my chin cracking against the wooden floorboards. The knife flew from my grasp, skittering away into the darkness with a sharp clatter. Pain exploded in my jaw. I tasted blood, hot and metallic. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, my body screaming, and twisted around to face my pursuer. The singing had stopped. In the suffocating dark, a figure stood. It was about 10 feet away, the size and shape of a small child, maybe 6 or 7 years old. It was just a silhouette, a cutout in the blackness. It stood perfectly still. I waited for it to move, to speak, to do something. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat in the awful silence. And then I realized. It wasn't just a silhouette because of the dark. It had no face. Where the eyes and nose and mouth should have been, there was just a smooth, uninterrupted surface, a blank canvas of skin. It tilted its head, a slow, inquisitive gesture. I think I screamed. I couldn't hear it. The world was a vortex of blackness and pain, and the silent, watching shape. This was it. This was the end. My body gave up. I slumped against the floor and squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the final touch. I blinked. A hard, long blink that felt like an eternity. When I opened my eyes, I was on the floor. Not on cold wood, but on the familiar worn pattern of the living room carpet. Sunlight, warm and golden, streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The apartment was quiet. The grandfather clock stood in the corner, its brass pendulum gleaming. The photo albums were still scattered on the floor. I could see the entryway from where I lay. The front door was there. Closed. Solid. Perfectly normal. My whole body ached. I pushed myself into a sitting position, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. My jaw throbbed. I touched it, and my fingers came away wet with blood. I had fallen. I must have had some kind of a seizure, a waking nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and fear. I fell and hit my head, and my brain went haywire. It was the only explanation that made any sense. My hand. I remembered the knife. I looked down, expecting to see it lying on the carpet nearby. It was already in my fist. I was clutching it so tightly my knuckles were white. But it wasn't the 8-inch chef's knife from the kitchen. It was a toy, made of cheap, bright red plastic. The blade was thick and flimsy, the tip rounded and safe. The kind of thing you would find in a child's playset. I stared at it, at the impossible object in my hand. A high-pitched sound started in my ears. I was holding the evidence. The scar. A message. I see you. I can change anything. Even your fear. Even your weapons. You're a toy in my house now. I didn't lock the door to my father's apartment on the way out. I didn't take anything. I left the scattered photos, the overturned furniture, the light on. I just ran. The red plastic knife was still in my hand, a stupid, bright shape against my white knuckles. I didn't let go of it until I was fumbling for my own car keys, and it clattered onto the asphalt of the parking lot. I left it there. A piece of trash. An offering. The drive was 20 minutes of highway lights and the low hum of the engine. I didn't turn on the radio. My own apartment felt like a fortress when I finally arrived. The solid thud of the door closing, the sharp click of the deadbolt sliding into place, a separate click for the chain lock. Sounds I had never paid attention to before now felt like a prayer. I went to the bathroom and leaned over the sink, my hands gripping the cold porcelain edge. In the mirror, my face was pale, slick with sweat. A dark, ugly bruise was already forming along my jawline, and a small, precise cut on my chin oozed a thin line of red. I had tasted the blood. It was real. I had fallen. The floorboards were real. The rest of it, the hallway, the faceless child, the singing, that was stress, grief. A mind pushed too far. It had to be. I splashed cold water on my face, the sting bringing a sharp, welcome clarity. The apartment had been a container for bad memories, and my mind had filled it with monsters. Now I was home, my space, my rules. The sickness was back there, locked in that third-floor tomb. I walked into my living room. It was clean, orderly. A gray sofa, a dark wood coffee table, a large television against the far wall. It was my sanctuary. I collapsed onto the sofa, the soft cushions a world away from the hard, worn carpet of my father's place. I needed noise. I needed to fill the space with something other than my own ragged breathing. I grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. A sitcom blared to life. A bright set. A laughing audience track. A man in a V-neck sweater was making a joke about his wife's cooking. The canned laughter erupted. It was mindless, perfect. I let the stupid, cheerful noise wash over me, a disinfectant for the brain. I focused on the rhythm of the jokes, the predictable rise and fall of the laugh track. Normal. This was normal. I was safe. My body slowly uncoiled. The tightness in my chest eased. My hands, which had been clenched into fists, began to relax. I was just tired. Overwrought. I would get a full night's sleep, and in the morning, the sharp edges of the nightmare would be blunted. I would hire movers to clear out the rest of my father's things. I wouldn't go back there alone. Problem solved. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. The sound made me jump, a sharp jolt of adrenaline that soured my stomach. I looked at the screen. The name glowed back at me. CHLOE. A wave of relief, so powerful it almost made me dizzy, crashed over me. Chloe. Her voice would be an anchor. Real. Grounded. I snatched the phone up, my thumb swiping to answer. Hey, I said. My voice was rough. Evan? You sound terrible, she said. Her voice was warm, familiar, a sound I knew better than my own. Are you okay? I figured you'd be done for the day. Yeah. Just a long day. The apartment was a bigger mess than I thought. I sank deeper into the sofa, closing my eyes, just listening to her breathe on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, babe. I wish I could have been there to help. It's fine. It's my mess to clean up, I said, the words tasting like ash. There was a short pause. The sitcom laugh track roared in the background. Well, you sound exhausted, she said. Maybe you should go back to your dad's place and get some rest? I hear it's quiet there. Every muscle in my body went rigid. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I opened my eyes and stared at the dark screen of the television. The canned laughter seemed to mock me. How? How did she know to say that? I had never once described my father's building as quiet. I had told her it was old. I had told her it was depressing. I had only ever told her I was tired from the physical work. Never that word, quiet. What? I managed to get out. The word was a dry rasp. I just said you should get some rest, she replied, her tone still light, still Chloe. You're obviously worn out. No. What did you say before that? About my dad's apartment. Another pause. Longer this time. The sitcom ended, and a commercial for a car dealership came on. A man was yelling about 0% financing. When her voice returned, it had changed. All the warmth was gone. All the inflection. It was flat, level, like a pre-recorded message. "Correction in progress," the voice said. It was her voice, but it wasn't her. "Subject is uncooperative. Recommend return to origin point." My blood ran cold. I couldn't breathe. "Chloe?" I whispered. The line went dead. The sudden silence was a physical blow. I stared at the phone in my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs. I hit redial. It went straight to a busy signal. A fast, insistent beep beep beep. I tried again. Beep beep beep. I dropped the phone on the cushion beside me and scrambled to my feet. I went to the window, pulling the blinds aside with a trembling hand. My apartment overlooked a residential street. Trees, parked cars, streetlights. It was a normal suburban scene, but as I watched, the streetlight directly across from my window flickered. Then it went out. A second later, it flashed on again. A single, short pulse. Then a longer one. Then another long one. Short. Long. Long. It kept repeating. A slow, deliberate rhythm against the dark, wet street. A signal. It wasn't random. My mind screamed at me that I was seeing patterns that weren't there, that I was breaking. But my eyes saw what they saw. A message, blinked out in a cold, sodium orange light. I let the blinds fall and backed away from the window. My sanctuary was gone. The walls were no longer a defense. They were just part of a larger cage. The television screen flickered. The car commercial vanished, replaced by a wall of hissing, monochrome static. For a second, that was all there was. Then, an image resolved itself out of the noise. It was a video feed. Grainy. Low resolution. The camera angle was from above, pointing down at a hallway. I recognized the cheap, beige carpet. The scuff mark near the floorboards. It was the view from the security camera outside my own front door. A figure was standing there. It was Chloe. Same trench coat she wore this morning. Same dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She was standing perfectly still, her back to the camera, facing my door. Then she raised her hand and knocked. 3 slow, rhythmic raps. As her knuckles made contact with the door on the screen, the sound echoed in the room with me. Thud. 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 The real sound, coming from the real door in my entryway, just a few feet behind me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my eyes glued to the television. On the screen, the figure of Chloe turned slowly, as if she knew the camera was there, and looked directly into the lens. It was her face. But the smile was wrong. It was too wide, stretching her mouth into an unnatural curve that didn't touch her eyes. And her eyes, in the grainy black and white of the feed, they were just dark pits. Empty. Devoid of light or reflection. A voice came through the solid wood of my front door. It was the same flat, mechanical voice from the phone call. "Evan, open the door." I think I made a sound. A choked, animal noise deep in my throat. I broke from my paralysis and ran. Not to the door. I ran the other way, into the short hall that led to my bedroom. I slammed the bedroom door shut and fumbled with the lock, my fingers feeling thick and useless. The lock clicked. It wasn't enough. My eyes darted around the room. My dresser. It was heavy, made of solid oak. I grabbed the sides, my sneakers slipping on the wood floor as I put my shoulder into it. It moved with a deep, groaning scrape. I threw all my weight into it, grunting with the effort, my muscles screaming. I shoved it sideways until it was wedged tight against the door, barricading it. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, and collapsed onto the edge of my bed. I was trapped, barricaded in my own room. I listened. The knocking had stopped. The voice was gone. There was only silence. A deep, listening silence that felt heavier than any sound. I waited for the wood of the door to splinter, for the lock to break, for the handle to turn. Minutes passed. Nothing. My phone, abandoned on the living room sofa, buzzed. The sound was faint, but I heard it. Another buzz. What now? A call? A threat? It buzzed again. A text message. The thought of walking back out there, past the front door, made my skin crawl. But the silence was worse. The not knowing was worse. Slowly, Shakily, I got to my feet. I moved the dresser just enough to open the bedroom door a crack and peered out. The living room was empty. The television was off, its screen a blank, black mirror. The apartment was still. I crept out, my bare feet silent on the floor. The front door remained closed. The deadbolt was still shot. The chain was still on. I snatched my phone from the sofa and retreated back into the bedroom, pushing the dresser back into place. Sitting on my bed, my back against the wall, I looked at the screen. One new message. From CHLOE. The timestamp read, 1 minute ago. My thumb shook as I opened it. The message was just a few words. Love you. Good night. XO. Below the text was a picture. A selfie. It was Chloe, lying in her bed. Her head was on her pillow, her hair fanned out around her. She was wearing an old t-shirt she always slept in. The lamp on her nightstand was on, casting a soft, warm glow. She was smiling. A real smile. Tired, gentle, and completely, utterly normal. Her apartment was a 40-minute drive away. There was no way she could be here and there. I stared at the photograph, at her face, at the timestamp on the message. My mind tried to connect the two events. The thing at the door with the wide, wrong smile, and the girl in this picture. It couldn't. The two realities could not exist at the same time. One was a lie, the thing at the door, the voice, the knocking, or this was a lie, this picture, this text. A perfectly crafted piece of evidence to make me think I was losing my mind. I didn't know which was worse. I looked from the phone to my barricaded door. The silence in the apartment pressed in on me. I was alone. But I didn't feel alone at all. The game hadn't ended at my father's apartment. I had just brought it home with me. The picture on my phone was a lie, or the knocking was a lie. My mind could not hold both. They were two separate, warring truths, and the space between them was a chasm I was about to fall into. I looked at my bedroom door, at the heavy oak dresser I'd shoved against it. A fortress built against a ghost. A gesture. Useless. The silence that followed was not relief. It was a held breath. The thing at the door was gone, but the knowledge of it remained, a stain on the air in my own apartment. I could not stay here. I could not sleep here, not with the image of that wide, fixed smile burned behind my eyes. Not with the memory of that flat, mechanical voice that wore Chloe's name. There was only one place to go, back to the origin. Back to the third-floor apartment that had birthed this. The thought was acid in my stomach, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was waiting in a barricaded room for the knocking to start again, not knowing if the next person I spoke to, the next face I saw, was real or a copy. The game wasn't about hiding anymore. It was about understanding the rules. Moving the dresser was a slow, painful process. The wood scraped against the floor, a sound that felt loud enough to wake the dead. I moved with a deliberate slowness, my ears straining for any sound from the living room. Nothing. The chain was still on the front door. The deadbolt was still thrown. I unlocked them, my hands slick with sweat on the cool metal. The hallway outside was empty. The security camera above watched me with its single, black eye. I didn't look back. The drive was a blur of streetlights and dark storefronts. I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I refused to look in the rearview mirror. I refused to check the passenger seat. If something was there, I didn't want to know. The car was a box, moving through the night. That was all. The parking lot of my father's building was nearly empty. I killed the engine. The sudden absence of the low hum was deafening. I sat for a long moment, my keys still in the ignition. I had run from this place. Now I was walking back in. My purpose had changed. I wasn't here to clean or to mourn. I was here to investigate, to dissect the scene of the crime. The apartment door was unlocked, just as I had left it. I pushed it open. The light was still on in the living room. The overturned chair, the scattered photographs on the floor. It was a snapshot of my panic. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the click of the latch echoing in the still air. This time, I turned the lock. Not to keep something out, but to keep myself in. To force myself to confront this place. I bypassed the living room and went straight to the small, cluttered room my father had used as an office. A cheap particle board desk was pushed against one wall, buried under stacks of paper. This was where he handled his life. Bills, bank statements, junk mail. If there was a clue to what had happened to him, to what was happening to me, it would be in this paper tomb. I sat in his old, squeaking desk chair and began to sort. My hands moved with a mechanical efficiency. I was not a son going through his father's effects. I was an archivist. A detective. Power company. Water bill. A final notice for a magazine subscription. I created separate piles on the floor. Most of it was useless. The mundane detritus of a lonely life. I worked for nearly an hour, the only sound the rustle of paper. My initial fear was being replaced by a dull, grinding frustration. There was nothing here. Just bills. Then I found it. Tucked between a gas bill and a catalog for fishing gear was a small black notebook, the kind you can buy at any drugstore. It was thin, the cover soft and worn. It felt different from the official, crisp feel of the bills. It felt personal. I opened it. The first few pages were written in my father's neat, careful script. The entries were dated, starting about 6 months ago. They spoke of loneliness, of the silence in the apartment, of watching the neighbors come and go. It was sad, but it was sane. It was the father I knew, the one I had neglected. A knot of guilt tightened in my chest. I kept reading, turning the pages. About a month in, the handwriting began to change. It became looser, the lines less steady. The entries were shorter, more frantic. October 12th. The coffee cup was on the wrong side of the sink this morning. I always leave it on the right. October 15th. The front door was unlocked. I know I locked it. I check it 3 times every night. I always check it 3 times. October 21st. Something is wrong with the pictures. The picture of Sarah on the mantel. Her smile is different. I know it is. The words were a cold echo of my own experience. The subtle changes. The gaslighting. I flipped further, my heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The handwriting was a near unintelligible scrawl now. He was writing about the changes constantly, about objects moving, about the layout of the apartment feeling unfamiliar. He sounded like a man losing his mind, or a man being driven there. Then, one entry stood out, circled several times in thick, angry ink. November 4th. It started with the sextant, the old brass one from the junk shop. Everything started when I brought it home. It watches. I think it watches. A sextant. An old navigational tool. I scanned the cluttered office, then the living room. I didn't remember seeing anything like that when I was here before. It wasn't on the mantel or the coffee table or any of the bookshelves. It was just another paranoid delusion, a focus object for his decay. I went back to the notebook, my finger tracing the frantic script. That was when I felt it. A change in the air. A deep, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with the thermostat. It sank into my skin, into my bones. I could see my own breath, a pale cloud in the lamplight. My eyes went to the coffee table in the living room. The brass sextant sat on the scarred wood. It wasn't there a minute ago. I had looked right at that table. It had been covered in dust and old magazines. Now the sextant was there, glinting under the light. It was heavy-looking, a complex arc of aged brass and glass lenses. It couldn't be there. I wasn't looking at the table, then I looked, and it was there. My mind refused the logic of it. It was a glitch in my perception, a skip in the film. Drawn by a force I didn't understand, I walked out of the office and stood over the table. The thing was real. I could smell the faint metallic scent of the old brass. Cautiously, I reached out and picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, and cold to the touch. An object out of time, an instrument for measuring the stars, lying in a dusty apartment. My father's note echoed in my head. It watches. I lifted the sextant to my eye, pointing it at the far wall of the living room, where a framed watercolor of a ship at sea was hanging. I peered through the small eyepiece. The world twisted. The straight lines of the picture frame bent into impossible curves. The wall itself seemed to breathe, to fold inward like crumpled paper. The colors of the painting ran together, the calm blue sea becoming a churning vortex of black and gray. It was a broken, non-Euclidean view of my reality, a glimpse into the geometry of a nightmare. I pulled it away from my eye, my heart hammering. My hand was shaking, and from the body of the sextant itself I heard a sound, a faint, dry whisper, like leaves skittering across pavement. It was my father's voice, but thin and stretched, an audio recording played on a dying battery. It sees. It's learning. Don't let it finish. The voice cut out. I dropped the sextant onto the carpet as if it were burning hot. It landed with a dull thud. Behind me, from the hallway, came a sound. A soft click. Then a low groan of wood. I turned slowly. The door to my father's bedroom closet, a door I knew had been closed, was now swinging slowly open. Darkness gaped from within. For a long second, nothing happened. Then, A figure stepped out. It was my father. He wore the same cardigan I remembered, the gray one with a hole in the elbow. He had the same thinning hair, the same tired slope to his shoulders. But it was not him. The thing that stood in the hallway was a poor imitation. Its skin was the color of whey, stretched too tight over the bones of its face. Its movements were jerky, disjointed, like a marionette with tangled strings. It took a shuffling step toward me, its head tilted at an angle that looked painful. Its mouth opened and closed, making a wet, clicking sound, but no words came out. I stumbled backward, my brain screaming at the sight. It was a caricature of my father, a sketch drawn from memory by something that didn't understand how a human body was supposed to work. It continued its lurching advance. I backed away, my feet clumsy. My heel caught the leg of the coffee table. I fell backward, hard. The back of my head hit the floor, a flash of white light behind my eyes. The replica of my father stood over me. It slowly crouched down, its joints popping audibly. It reached a hand toward my face. The hand was thin and pale, the knuckles too large. And one finger, the index finger, was bent completely backward, pointing up at its own wrist. It was the last thing I saw. I closed my eyes tight, a raw sound of terror tearing from my throat. I waited for the touch, for the cold, wrong fingers on my skin. I waited for the pain. Nothing happened. After what felt like an eternity, I forced my eyes open. It was gone. The hallway was empty. The closet door was closed. I was alone, lying on the floor, the pain in my head a dull throb. The apartment was still again. I pushed myself up, my body trembling uncontrollably. My eyes darted around the room, expecting it to reappear from any shadow. But there was only the quiet, dusty apartment. My gaze fell on the black notebook, lying open on the floor where I had dropped it. I crawled over to it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pick it up. There was one page left. The last page. My father's final entry. The handwriting was a barely legible disaster, the pen having dug deep into the paper. It made a copy of me tonight. It almost got it right. But it made a mistake, a flaw in the design. It can't replicate sadness. I stared at the words, a cold understanding dawning. I looked up at the spot on the floor where the thing had crouched over me, where its pale, backward bent hand had reached for me. There, on a dusty floorboard, was a single, tiny, perfect drop of water, clear and bright, like a fallen tear. The drop of water on the floorboard was the period at the end of a sentence I could not fully read. It was a fact. A single, solid fact, in a world that had dissolved into a nightmare of shifting ink and wrong angles. My father's last message. It can't replicate sadness. A flaw. A bug in the code. I didn't understand the mechanism, but I understood the implication. The thing that had stood over me, wearing my father's face, was a fabrication. A poor one. A purpose solidified in my gut, hard and cold as a stone. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else. A hunter's instinct. Or maybe just the cornered rats. The source was the sextant. My father's note, the way it appeared, the broken view of the world it offered. It was the anchor. The point of infection. My mind latched onto a simple, powerful thought. Destroy it. My body trembled as I pushed myself off the floor. The back of my head throbbed with a dull, insistent rhythm. Every muscle ached with a tension that was bone deep. I ignored it. I crawled over to the couch, my hand reaching for the canvas tote bag I'd brought my things in. I emptied my jacket and a water bottle onto the cushions, then turned back to the coffee table. The brass sextant lay on the carpet where I had dropped it. It didn't look like much. Just an old piece of metal and glass, but I could feel a presence from it now. A low hum in the air that was more a feeling in my teeth than a sound in my ears. Don't let it finish. My father's whisper was a fresh memory, a command. It was learning. The copy of my father was a test run. The thing that called me on the phone, the thing that wore Chloe's voice, was another. It was getting better. I picked up the sextant. The metal was frigid, leaching the warmth from my hand instantly. It felt heavier than it should, a dense, concentrated weight. I didn't look through the eyepiece again. I didn't dare. I shoved it into the tote bag. The canvas sagged around it. I slung the bag over my shoulder. The weight of it against my back was a constant, chilling reminder of my task. I would take it far from here. To the old quarry. I would smash it to pieces with a sledgehammer and bury the fragments. But I couldn't leave yet. Not like this. My hands were shaking too badly to hold a car key. My breath was a ragged, shallow thing in my chest. I needed a moment. Just one moment to put myself back together before I walked out that door and into the night. The bathroom. Cold water. The thought was an instinct. I walked down the short hall, the bag bumping against my spine with every step. The door to my father's bedroom was closed. The closet door was also closed, as if nothing had happened. My hand was slick on the bathroom doorknob. I pushed it open. The small, windowless room was lit by a single bare bulb above the medicine cabinet mirror. The air was still and smelled of old soap and mildew. It was blessedly normal. White tile, a yellowing shower curtain, a pedestal sink. I set the tote bag down by the door, the sextant making a muffled thud as it hit the linoleum floor. I leaned over the sink, my hands gripping the cool porcelain edges. I stared at my reflection. My face was pale, my hair a mess. There was a dark smudge of dirt on my cheek. My eyes were wide, the pupils blown out. I looked like a man who had seen a ghost. A poor one. I turned on the cold tap. The gush of water was a loud grounding noise. I cupped my hands and splashed the icy water on my face again and again. The shock of it was a sharp, clean pain. It cut through the fog in my head. I took a deep breath, the smell of chlorine and old pipes filling my lungs. I straightened up, water dripping from my chin and nose onto the porcelain. The man in the mirror did not. My heart stopped. It did not beat. It did not move. It was a lead weight in my chest. I was looking straight ahead. The reflection of me was still bent over the sink, its head down, its dark, wet hair obscuring its face. I could see the back of its neck, the curve of its spine. It was a perfect copy of my posture from 1 second ago. Time stretched. A second. 10. A minute. I did not breathe. I did not move. I just watched the frozen image of myself in the mirror. My mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by a level of impossibility it could not process. This wasn't a moving object. This wasn't a misplaced picture. This was a violation of the most basic law I knew. A mirror shows you what is there. Slowly. So slowly. The head in the mirror began to rise. It was not a smooth motion. It was a series of tiny, incremental jerks, as if a machine was lifting it, cog by cog. The wet hair fell away from its face, plastered to its skin. It was my face. The shape of the jaw was my jaw. The nose was my nose. But the eyes were not my eyes. They were pits. Black, polished stones that reflected no light. And the mouth was wrong. My lips were pressed together in a thin line of terror. Its lips were beginning to part. A slow, mechanical widening. It was not a smile of humor or warmth. It was the expression of something learning how muscles worked, and finding the results interesting. I took a step back, my wet hand slipping on the edge of the sink. A small, choked sound escaped my throat. The thing in the mirror raised its hand, my right hand. It pressed its palm flat against the surface of the glass from the other side, but the glass did not remain solid. Where its palm and fingers touched, the mirror's surface rippled. It moved like quicksilver, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. The ripples spread outward from its hand, distorting the reflection of the light bulb and the tiled wall behind it. Then it spoke. It used my voice, but the sound was different. It came from the mirror itself, thin and metallic, with no resonance, no life. The words were perfectly formed, but they were not human speech. They were data. This instance is unstable. The black eyes stared into mine. The grotesque smile widened another millimeter. Too many errors. A flaw in the memory architecture. Correction required. As it spoke, the room behind me began to change. I felt it before I saw it, a lurch in my stomach like a falling elevator. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The white tiled wall was no longer flat. The grout lines between the tiles were bending, stretching like hot taffy. The corner where the wall met the shower seemed to pull away, receding into an impossible distance. Then it rushed back in, the space contracting with a silent, nauseating concertina effect. The door I had come through looked further away than it should be. The small bathroom was becoming a vast, distorted chamber. I turned back to the mirror. The thing was still there, hand pressed against the rippling glass. It saw the fear on my face. Its smile completed itself. A perfect crescent moon gash in the face of a stranger who looked just like me. Initiating diagnostic, it said in that dead recorded version of my voice. Stand by. Then it slammed its fist into the mirror. The sound was a gunshot in the small, warping room. The glass didn't just shatter, it exploded. A spiderweb of 1,000 cracks erupted from the point of impact. The reflection splintered into 1,000 different me's. A hand, its hand, my hand, punched through the ruined center of the mirror. It was not a reflection anymore. It was a solid thing, emerging from the broken silver plane into my world. Shards of glass rained down into the sink, tinkling like broken chimes. The arm that followed the hand was mine. The sleeve of the blue shirt I was wearing was mine. But the fingers were not. They were too long. They uncurled with a deliberate, unnatural slowness. They moved with the jointed precision of a mantis's leg, twitching and testing the air. I yelled, a raw, animal noise torn from the base of my throat. The hand lunged for me. There was no thought. There was only action. I threw my body to the side, my shoulder slamming into the wall. The wall gave way like cardboard, my arm sinking into it up to the elbow before the geometry snapped back into place, spitting me out. The long, pale fingers of the copy snagged the collar of my shirt, pulling me forward. I could smell ozone and the scent of burnt wiring. My eyes fell on the medicine cabinet, a heavy, old, metal thing, bolted to the wall, with a broken mirror fixed to its front. My hands found the sides of it. I dug my fingers in. The metal was cold and solid. Real. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength I didn't know I possessed, I heaved. There was a screech of protesting metal as the old bolts began to tear from the crumbling plaster. The hand gripping my shirt was yanked back as the whole cabinet tilted forward. I gave another desperate, screaming shove. The bolts ripped free. The entire medicine cabinet, mirror and all, tore away from the wall and crashed down. It hit the edge of the porcelain sink with a deafening clang of metal on ceramic, then toppled onto the floor in an avalanche of destruction. The sink cracked down the middle. Bottles of aspirin and old shaving cream exploded across the linoleum. The already broken mirror disintegrated into 1,000 more pieces. The arm that had reached for me was gone, severed from its reality by the collapse of its gateway. I was on my knees, gasping for air. My chest burned. My throat was raw. A sharp sting on my cheek made me reach up. My fingers came away wet. A thin line of blood trickled down my face from a flying shard of glass. The bathroom was stable again. The walls were flat. The door was where it should be. The quiet that followed was absolute. All I could hear was my own ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of my own heart. Slowly, shakily, I looked down. The floor was a disaster area of shattered glass, white powder, and twisted metal. And in every piece of mirror, every tiny glittering shard, there was a reflection. I looked at the largest piece. Near my foot, it showed a face. My face. But its mouth was open in a silent, unending scream. The features pulled taut with horror. I shifted my gaze to a smaller, triangular fragment. This one reflected me laughing. A silent, manic, hysterical laugh, head thrown back, eyes squeezed shut in mirthless joy. Another piece, thin as a razor blade, showed my face, but it was old. Deeply lined, withered, with cataracts clouding the eyes. Another showed me crying, thick, slow tears, carving paths through the dirt on a face I didn't recognize as my own. I began to crawl, my hands brushing past the dangerous edges of the glass. I looked from piece to piece, a face with its features slightly rearranged, the nose an inch too high. A face that was melting like wax, a face with a mouth where an eye should be. 100 different versions, 100 failed renders. I searched every piece, big and small, from the palm-sized chunks to the glittering dust. Not a single one showed the man who was actually there, crouched on the floor, bleeding onto the shattered remains of his own face. I scrambled backwards on my hands and knees. The tiny, sharp edges of the mirror shard scraped my palms. I did not look at them. I did not want to see the 100 different men I was not. My breath was a wet, ragged noise in my ears. I felt the slickness of blood on my cheek, a warm track down my skin. My eyes found the canvas tote bag by the bathroom door. I lunged for it, my fingers closing around the rough fabric. The weight inside felt dense, heavy, a dead thing. I pushed myself up, using the doorframe for support. My legs shook. I left the bathroom. I did not look back at the shattered reflections, at the cracked sink, at the wreckage of my own face. I pulled the door shut. The click of the latch was a small, final sound. I stood in the hall. The apartment was quiet, the weight of the bag pulled on my shoulder. My plan was simple. Get to the car. Drive to the quarry. Smash the source of this infection. But the keys felt a universe away. My hands were trembling too much to fit a key in an ignition. The world outside the front door felt impossibly large and complex. One moment. I needed one moment. My mind, a frantic animal in a cage, latched onto a thought. My father, his neatness, his records. The note he left me was a warning. It can't replicate sadness. A clue. There might be more. Something to explain this. To give me a weapon beyond a sledgehammer and blind panic. The office. I had only glanced inside when I first arrived. Now it felt like the only place left to look. I walked down the hallway, each step a conscious effort. The bag bumped against my hip, a constant, cold reminder. The door to his office was ajar. I pushed it open. The room smelled of old paper, dust, and a faint, acidic scent of dried ink. A heavy wooden desk dominated the space, its surface a controlled chaos of stacked journals, pens in a cup, and a heavy, green glass banker's lamp. Bookshelves lined one wall, packed tight. This was his sanctuary, the brain of the apartment. I set the tote bag on the floor beside the door. I needed my hands free. I started with the desk. I pulled open the top drawer. Old checkbooks, paper clips, dried out pens. Useless. The next drawer held files. Tax returns, insurance policies, the deed to the house. I flipped through them, my fingers clumsy. Nothing. It was all so mundane, so horribly, terribly normal. I moved along the bookshelves, my eyes scanning the spines. Navigation, astronomy, naval history. A life's collection of a single obsession. I pulled a few books out at random, shaking them. A folded bookmark fell out of one. Nothing else. This was a waste of time. My real plan, the only plan, was in the car. The sledgehammer in the trunk. The quarry road. I stopped, my body sagging against a bookshelf. Defeated. I was just delaying. I was a coward, hiding in a dead man's office while reality unraveled around me. I sank to my knees. The carpet was thin and rough. My head hung low. I was going to die in here. My eyes were level with the underside of the desk. It was just dark wood and shadows. But my father, he was a creature of habit and caution. He didn't trust banks. He kept emergency cash taped in envelopes behind paintings. If there was one last message, one final, terrible secret, he would not leave it in a drawer. I crawled forward. The dust bunnies under the desk were thick as felt. I reached up, my fingers tracing the rough, unfinished wood of the underside. My fingertips brushed against something, paper, held in place with a strip of old, yellowed cellophane tape. My heart hammered against my ribs. I peeled the tape carefully. It came away with a faint ripping sound, taking a few splinters of wood with it. I backed out from under the desk, clutching a small, folded piece of notepaper. It was from the same legal pad as the first note. His handwriting was shaky. The ink bled slightly into the paper, but the words were clear. It isn't a power source. It's the cage. It is contained in the object. Destroying it releases it. The last two words and the question mark hung in the air. A hypothesis. A terrible, last-minute doubt. I stared at the paper, the meaning failing to connect with the panic in my brain. It was a cage. I was holding its cage? My plan to smash it, to destroy it. What did that mean? A warmth bloomed from the doorway. I looked up. The canvas tote bag on the floor began to emit a low hum. It was not a sound I heard with my ears. It was a vibration on the floorboards, in my teeth. The brass sextant inside the bag was heating up. I could see a faint, shimmering distortion in the air around the canvas. The room lurched. The pencils in the cup on the desk lifted up, standing on their points. They began to spin, slowly at first, then faster. A blur of yellow wood, the heavy glass lamp flickered, went out, then turned back on, but the light it cast was a deep, bruised violet. The books on the shelves began to tremble. One by one, they slid forward, they opened. Pages fluttering in a non-existent wind. Faster and faster, a storm of paper and print. I was on the floor, frozen. My eyes were fixed on the wall opposite me. The wall with the window that looked out onto the street. The cheap, cream-colored paint began to bubble. I saw it shift, like oil on water. The texture of the drywall smoothed out, then became translucent. I could see the wood studs behind it, then they too faded. The wall dissolved. It did not explode or crumble, it just ceased to be. In its place was not the street, not the neighbor's house, not the night sky. It was a void. A patch of pure, non-reflective blackness. It was a hole cut in the world. Floating in its depths were stars. They were not the soft, distant lights of our sky. They were sharp, cold, geometric points of white and blue, and they did not twinkle. They were wrong. A force took hold of me. A silent, immense pressure. It was not wind. It was a pull. The space itself was pulling me. My body slid a few inches across the carpet. The loose papers from the desk flew past me, sucked into the blackness and vanishing. The tote bag with the sextant slid across the floor and stopped at the edge of the void, glowing with a dull red heat. My hands flew out, scrabbling for a hold. My fingers dug into the thin carpet. It ripped away. I was sliding faster now, toward the hole in reality. My shoulder hit something hard, the leg of the desk. I wrapped my arms around it, clinging to it as the pull intensified. The old oak groaned. My muscles screamed. The strain in my shoulders and back was a sharp, tearing fire. I was a flag in a hurricane. From the center of the void, something emerged. It was a shape. I cannot describe it with words for color or form. It was a collection of lines that met at angles that my eyes could not follow. It was a series of curves that folded in on themselves. It was a structure with a surface that was also its interior. Looking at it made my head swim. A wave of nausea washed over me. It drifted from the depths of the hole, moving toward me, silent and unhurried. It was the thing that wore my father's face. It was the thing that wore my face in the mirror. This was its true form. If it touched me, I would not just die. I would be unwritten. I saw the office chair, a few feet away. A simple wooden dining chair my father used at his desk. It was being pulled, too, scraping slowly across the floor. Desperation gave me a burst of strength. I held onto the desk leg with one arm, my joints screaming, and reached out with my other hand. My fingers brushed the back of the chair. I hooked it. I pulled it toward me. It was heavy, fighting the pull of the void. I had one chance. Not to fight the shape. To fight the source. The cage. The sextant. It lay on the floor, bathing the edge of the void in its hellish red light. With a yell that was torn from my lungs, I heaved the chair. I threw it with all the strength I had left. I aimed for the glowing bag. The chair flew for a moment. It traveled maybe 3 feet. Then it stopped. It hung in the air, halfway between me and the sextant. The wood began to twist. The back legs bent at a severe angle, snapping with a sound like pistol shots. The seat cracked down the middle. The whole chair collapsed in on itself, crushed by a force I could not see. It fell to the floor in a pile of splintered, broken wood. It never even got close. The pull ceased. It happened in an instant. The immense pressure was gone. The shape in the void paused. The blackness folded inward, the star field shrinking like a closing iris. The cream-colored wall was simply there again, solid and unremarkable. The books fell shut. The pencils clattered onto the desk. The violet light in the lamp turned back to its normal, soft green, silence. I was left on the floor, gasping. My body was limp with adrenaline's aftermath. My arms and back throbbed with a deep, muscular pain. The room was a mess, but it was just a room again. I lay there for a long time, my cheek pressed against the rough carpet. I listened to the sound of my own heart beating. The crumpled note was still in my hand. My eyes went from the note to the pile of shattered wood that used to be a chair, then to the tote bag on the floor. It was just a canvas bag again. The light was gone. I pushed myself into a sitting position. I looked at the note again. It isn't a power source, it's the cage. It tried to stop me from hitting the sextant. It defended it. The void, the pull, the shape, it was all a defense mechanism. A dog barking when you get too close to its food bowl. Destroying it releases it? I understood now. The question mark wasn't my father's doubt. It was his final, horrifying realization. He had figured it out too late. All my frantic planning, the drive to the quarry, the sledgehammer. I was about to walk to the cage, key in hand, and open the door out of sheer stupid terror. I wasn't fighting it. I was about to give it exactly what it wanted. I looked at the sextant in its bag. It was the lock, the bars, the one thing keeping that hole from swallowing everything. The opposite of my plan was not to run. It was not to hide. The opposite was to become the warden. To stay here. To guard this object for the rest of my life, fighting off its influence, moment by moment, until I went insane or it finally wore me down. A lifetime of this. of walls dissolving, and faceless things in mirrors. I looked at the broken chair, at the solid wall that had been a gateway to another universe moments before. It had tried to take me. It had almost succeeded. It would try again. A new thought formed. It was not born of panic or fear. It was a cold, hard piece of logic in the ruins of my mind. I cannot be its warden. I will not live like this. My old plan was born of a desire to kill the monster. My new plan was born of a desire to end the torture. I looked at the sextant. I saw the cage. I saw the monster inside. And I saw the key. I would not smash it to save myself from the haunting. I would smash it to save myself from the lifelong duty of being its keeper. Let it out. Let the cage break. Whatever happened to the world outside was not my concern. My world had already ended. The only choice left was how I would face the oblivion, cowering in a cage with the monster, or opening the door and letting it have me, and everything else. A quiet resolve settled in my chest, heavy and cold as stone. I was going to the quarry. I was going to open the cage. The cold cemented my bones. The adrenaline was gone, burned away, leaving behind a hard, clear purpose. I was not a prisoner. I was not a warden. I was the man with the key. I left the note on the floor. I walked out of the office, stepping over the wreckage of the chair. In the hall, I went to the coat closet. I knew there was a toolbox on the top shelf. I had seen it my first day here, a red metal box with a rusted latch. Behind it, leaning in the corner, was what I needed. The wood handle was smooth and dark with age and sweat. The 8-pound head was chipped and scarred. My father had used it once to break up a concrete step in the backyard. I took it. The weight felt good in my hands. It felt final. I returned to the office. The tote bag sat on the floor, an ordinary object that had held a tear in the universe. I tipped it over. The brass sextant slid out onto the carpet with a dull thud. It looked smaller than I remembered, less menacing. Just a piece of old navigational equipment, brass and glass and mirrors. A cage. I dragged it to the center of the room. The metal scraped against the wood floor I uncovered by kicking the rug aside. I wanted a hard surface. I wanted a clean break. I stood over it, the sledgehammer held loosely in my hands. I took a deep breath. The air tasted of dust and old paper. This was it. An execution. For my father, for his memory, for whatever was left of me. I would not live in this cage with the monster. I would break the lock. I would end it. I tightened my grip, knuckles white. I raised the sledgehammer over my shoulder, my muscles bunching, my body coiling like a spring. And the world went dead. It was not a lessening of sound. It was an erasure. The hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen vanished. The whisper of air through the vents stopped. The distant rumble of a truck down the street was cut off mid-rumble. All sound ceased to exist. In its place was a pressure that pushed in on my eardrums. I could hear the wet thumping of my own heart. I could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the blood moving behind my eyes. I stood frozen, the hammer held high. My shadow, cast on the cream-colored wall by the green desk lamp, was a perfect, dark silhouette of a man about to strike a blow. Then it moved. It did not shiver or flicker. It peeled itself away from the wall. My own body was still, but my shadow leaned forward, detaching. It was no longer a projection of me. It was a thing in itself, a flat, two-dimensional shape of blackness that slid from the wall onto the floor. It flowed like a spill of ink, growing larger, stretching, swallowing the patterns of the hardwood floor. It covered the pile of broken chair parts, and they vanished into its form. It crept up the legs of the desk. The darkness climbed, and the room grew colder. My feet were sinking. I looked down. The hardwood floor beneath my boots was softening. The planks were losing their hard edges, the varnish turning into a thick brown mud. It swirled around my ankles, pulling me down with a slow, powerful grip. I tried to lift a foot, and it came free with a thick, sucking sound. The mud, or whatever it was now up to my shins. It was a struggle to stay upright. The weight of the hammer felt immense. A shape bulged from the wall to my left. The wallpaper tore as a form pressed out from behind it. It was not a hand. It was the idea of a hand. 5 long bulges of plaster and lath that reached for me, the cracked paint flaking off like skin. Another one pushed out from the wall on my right, straining, reaching for the sledgehammer. The voices started then, not from any one place but from the air itself. "Kyle, stop." It was my mother's voice. I hadn't heard it in 10 years. It was soft, pleading. It came from a spot near the ceiling. "Don't do this. Please, baby, don't." Another voice, from the floor this time. Sarah. The curve of her name in my memory was a pain I had carried for years. Her voice was thin, reedy, full of the tears I had caused. "You're hurting us," another voice joined in, a chorus of whispers I couldn't place. Friends from college, a teacher from high school, everyone I had ever known and disappointed. Their spectral regret filled the room, a pressure as real as the silence. The mud was at my knees now. The plaster fingers were inches from my arms. And then, a new voice. It was my own. It spoke from right behind my ear, a clear, calm statement. "Don't do it, son." The words were a physical blow. I stumbled, the pull of the floor almost taking me down. I fought to keep my footing in the mire. The sledgehammer swayed in my grip. I looked at the sextant on the floor. It was the source. It was the focus. It was the only thing that mattered. The air in front of me shimmered, like heat rising from pavement. The light from the desk lamp bent around a spot between me and the sextant. The spot solidified. It took on color and texture. A worn gray sweater, faded denim jeans, brown leather shoes, scuffed at the toe. It was my father. Not the twisted thing from the mirror, not the flawed mask. It was him, exactly as he was in my sharpest memories. His hair was thin on top. His face was lined with a familiar weariness, but his eyes were clear. They were full of a terrible, profound sorrow. He stood there, between me and the instrument on the floor. He just looked at me. Tears began to stream down his cheeks, yet his expression did not change. "You can't," he said. His voice was not a phantom whisper. It was real. It was his voice, the one that had read to me as a child, the one that had yelled at me the last time we spoke. It vibrated in the bones of my chest. I stared at him, at the perfect replica of the man whose failures I had inherited. The mud was at my waist, a heavy, cold weight. The plaster hands were brushing against my sleeves. The sledgehammer felt like it was made of lead. "You'll kill us all," the replica of my father said, its voice breaking. It took a step toward me, its hand outstretched in a plea. A scream built in my throat. It was pure rage, a single sharp point of fury at all of it. At the guilt. At the fear. At this final, cruel manipulation. "You are not my father," I roared, the sound ripping through the silence. I put every ounce of my strength, every fiber of my being into the swing. I didn't aim for the sextant. I aimed for the thing wearing his face. I swung the hammer in a flat, horizontal arc, aiming for its chest. The weight carried me, twisting my body in the thick, pulling floor. The hammerhead connected with the gray sweater. There was no impact, no resistance. It was like swinging through a column of cold fog. For a split second, my vision went gray. The shape of my father dissolved around the hammer, a brief swirl of colorless mist. The force of my own swing, meeting nothing, almost dislocated my shoulder. It threw me off balance, and I fell to one knee with a grunt, my leg plunging deeper into the floor mud. As the replica vanished, a single, final whisper brushed against my mind. It was not a plea. It was not a warning. It was a sigh of relief. "Thank you for releasing me." The words hung in the air for a second. The pressure in the room changed. The plaster hands retracted back into the walls, leaving cracked, torn wallpaper behind. The mud around me lost its grip, solidifying back into hardwood floorboards with a series of sharp, cracking sounds. The silence broke. The hum of the refrigerator returned. The world snapped back into place. I was on one knee in the center of the office, panting. The sledgehammer was heavy in my hand. In front of me, on the floor, sat the brass sextant. Unharmed. A moment of hesitation. A flicker of doubt. Releasing me? What did that mean? Was that him? A part of him? Trapped in the performance? "I'll fall." No, it didn't matter. It was another trick. Another lie woven from my own memories. There was only one truth left in this apartment. The cage, the monster, and the hammer in my hands. The choice was the same. My torture, or its freedom. I would not be its keeper. I pushed myself to my feet, my muscles screaming. I ignored the phantom whisper. I ignored the momentary peace. I lifted the sledgehammer high above my head, higher than before. My arms trembled with the strain. I looked down at the polished brass, at the small dark lens that looked like a dead eye. I brought the hammer down, There was no sound of shattering metal. There was no crack of breaking glass. As the iron head met the brass body, the sextant did not break. It shrieked. It was a sound that was not a sound. It was a spike of pure pressure that slammed into me, that vibrated through the floor, up my legs into my teeth. It was a physical assault of noise. A window across the room shattered, the glass exploding outward into the night. The books on the shelves flew from their places as if kicked from behind. The heavy desk lamp burst, showering the desk in green glass and sparks. The sextant buckled under the blow, the brass denting, the frame twisting into a broken shape, and from the cracked lens a light bled out. Not red, not violet. It was a pouring, oily blackness, a spot of anti-light that spilled onto the floor and began to spread. The shriek intensified, a single, rising, inhuman tone of agony and release. I raised the hammer again, my ears ringing, my vision swimming. I brought it down a second time on the twisted metal. The cage broke. The silence dropped like a guillotine. One moment, the shriek was tearing through my bones. The next, nothing. Only the high, thin whine in my own ears remained. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt dust. I stood over the wreckage, the 8-pound sledgehammer hanging heavy in my grip. My arms hummed with the shock of the impacts. My knuckles were white. I let the hammer go. It fell from my hands and hit the floor with a heavy, final thud. The sound was loud in the new quiet. I swayed on my feet. I looked down at what was left. The brass sextant was a mangled knot of metal. Wires and gears spilled from its broken frame like guts. The lens that had held the blackness was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks across a dead eye. It was done. It was broken. I waited for the walls to melt. I waited for the floor to turn to mud. I waited for a voice to whisper from the corner of the room. Nothing came. The overturned desk, the books spilled across the floor, the shattered glass from the window, they were just objects. Wreckage from a fight. Nothing more. A tremor started in my knees. I sank down, my legs giving out. My knees hit the hardwood floor, the impact jarring up my spine. I was on all fours, panting, gulping air that tasted like grit and freedom. A single, dry sob escaped my throat. It was a harsh, ugly sound. Then, another. A laugh pushed its way out, sharp and barking. Laughter and sobs tangled together, ripping out of me in a wave. I pressed my forehead to the cool, dusty floorboards. The pressure on my skull was a welcome anchor. The shaking in my body was violent, a storm breaking. The wetness on the wood beneath my eyes wasn't mud. It was just tears. I cried until my throat was raw and my lungs ached. A man, alone, kneeling in a room he had just destroyed. After a long time, the shaking subsided. I was left hollowed out, scraped clean. My body felt like one big bruise, but the buzzing under my skin was gone. I pushed myself up into a sitting position, my back against the leg of the heavy, overturned desk. I looked around the office. The green-globed desk lamp was a shower of broken glass on the blotter. The desk chair was a pile of splintered wood and torn vinyl. The window that looked out onto the fire escape was a black, empty square, the cool night air drifting in. My gaze traveled over an overturned bookshelf, its contents fanned out across the rug. I saw the spines of books I remembered from my childhood. Moby Dick, a collection of poetry by Sandburg. An atlas of the world, its cover faded. They were just books. My eyes found the small, silver-plated frame I had thrown against the wall days ago. I had been sure a face in the background had changed. I crawled over to it, my knees protesting. I picked it up. The glass was cracked, but the picture was clear. It was me and him, at a lake. I must have been 10. He had his arm around my shoulder, a cheap fishing rod in his other hand. He was smiling, his eyes crinkled at the corners. It was his smile, his real one. There were no strangers in the background, just trees and the flat gray surface of the water. I ran my thumb over the crack in the glass. It was just a photo. It had always been just a photo. A calm settled into my bones, a heavy, leaden kind of calm. I had won. I had faced the thing that lived in the corners of my mind, the thing that wore my father's face, and I had smashed it to pieces. Slowly, painfully, I got to my feet. Every muscle screamed. I used the wall for support and made my way out of the office. The hallway was just a hallway. I ran a hand along the wallpaper. It was just paper, cool and slightly rough under my fingertips. No shapes pushed from behind it. It did not breathe. I walked to the front door of the apartment. My hand hesitated over the doorknob. This had been a test before, the door that led nowhere. I turned the knob. It clicked. I pulled the door open. The hallway outside was dimly lit by a single fly-speck bulb in the ceiling. The green, peeling paint on the opposite wall was exactly as I remembered it. The air smelled of old dust and someone's boiled cabbage. It was the hallway. Just the real, dingy, uneventful hallway. I closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality. I went into the bathroom. I braced myself. I looked up at the medicine cabinet mirror. The face that stared back was a wreck. My hair was matted with sweat and dirt. There was a long, red scratch on my cheek where a shard of glass must have flown. My eyes were bloodshot, ringed with dark circles. But they were my eyes. The reflection moved when I moved. It was me. Just me. Weary. Filthy. But me. I turned on the tap. Clear water sputtered out, then ran in a steady stream. I cupped my hands and splashed the cold water on my face. It stung the scratch, a clean, sharp pain. It was the best feeling I had ever had. Back in the living room, I stared at the television. Another source of torment. The news anchor with the wrong-colored tie. The commercials for products that did not exist. I found the remote on the floor, half buried under a cushion that had been thrown from the couch. I pointed it at the screen and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life. A woman with blonde hair was talking. And that multi-car pileup on the I-5 has traffic backed up for miles. Expect major delays if you're heading south toward the bridge this evening. In other news, City Council has... I listened to her voice. It was flat, professional. Boring. I watched her talk about the traffic, about a vote on zoning laws. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. I flicked through the channels. A sitcom with a laugh track. A black and white movie. A nature documentary about penguins. It was all so wonderfully, blessedly normal. My phone was on the kitchen counter, where I'd left it. The screen was dark. I picked it up. My hands were still shaking, but less now. I scrolled through my contacts and found her name. Sarah. The memory of her voice, thin and reedy and full of tears pleading for me from the floor of the office, made my stomach clench. It wasn't her. It was a weapon made for my own guilt. I had to know. I had to be sure. My thumb hovered over the call button. This was the real test. What if I called and her voice was wrong? What if she said something that didn't make sense? What if the call connected to that whispering chorus from the walls? The fear was a cold knot in my gut. I had to cut it out. I pressed the button. It rang once, twice. My heart hammered against my ribs. Hello? Her voice. It was her voice, a little sleepy, a little annoyed, not a phantom, not a weapon. It was just Sarah, probably irritated that I was calling so late. Kyle, is that you? It's almost 2 a.m. I couldn't speak. I just listened to the sound of her. The sound of reality. Kyle, are you there? Is everything okay? Now her voice was laced with concern. Yeah, I managed to say. My own voice was a croak. I cleared my throat. Yeah, I'm here. I'm okay. You don't sound okay. Where are you? Are you still at your dad's place? I am, I said, my eyes scanning the living room. The couch was on its side. A lamp was shattered on the floor. I'm almost done here. Well, hurry up and come home, she said. The warmth in her voice was a physical thing, something I could feel through the phone. I miss you. I'll be home soon, I promised. I love you. I love you too. Be safe, she said, and then she hung up. I lowered the phone. The line was dead. The call was over. I had passed the test. Every test. The nightmare was over. The fever had broken. I had fought a monster, and I had won. But as I stood in the kitchen, the silence of the apartment settled back in. It was a different kind of silence now. Not a presence, but an absence. And in that absence, a new feeling began to sprout. A tiny, cold seed of a thought. I walked back into the living room and stood in the middle of the floor. My eyes went from one object to the next. The couch. The lamp. The rug. They were all just things. They weren't changing. They weren't shifting. I went to the kitchen and opened a cupboard. I took out a glass. A simple, heavy-bottomed whiskey tumbler. My father's favorite. I held it in my hand. It felt solid. Real. I turned it over and over, my thumb rubbing the smooth, cool surface. I was waiting for the glass to warp, to become something else in my hand. It didn't. It was just a glass. I set it down on the counter. The sound of glass on laminate was sharp. Normal. This was the new game. The monster wasn't in the walls anymore. It was in my head. The real torture wasn't watching the world change. It was watching it stay the same, and not being able to trust it. Every steady object, every normal sound, every correct reflection was a question. Is it real this time? Or is it just a more perfect illusion? A better cage? I went through the apartment one more time, room by room. A pilgrimage of doubt. My hand on the solid bedroom door. My gaze sweeping the closet, filled with his old, neatly hung suits. My fingers tracing the grout between the bathroom tiles. Each check came back clean. Each test was passed, but with each passing test, the seed of coldness in my gut grew a little bigger. The quiet was louder than the shriek had been. The normalcy was more unsettling than the chaos. Because the chaos, I could fight. This, I could only endure. Finally, I went back to the office. The cool night air felt good. It swept the dust and the stale smells out of the room. I stood at the broken window, my hands on the sill. I looked down at the street below. A few cars passed, their headlights cutting cones of light through the darkness. A man walked his dog on the other side of the street. The streetlights cast a yellow glow that felt familiar and right. The world outside the apartment had not been infected. It had not been consumed. It was over. I had to believe that. The thing in the sextant was dead. The echoes in my head were just that. Echoes. Scars. They would fade. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, clean air. I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. I had survived. I was free. The monster was dead, shattered in pieces on the floor behind me. I had left the nightmare in the wreckage. I let the air out in a long, slow sigh. I felt light. I didn't look back. I pulled the heavy apartment door shut behind me, the sound of the latch catching final and dull. I didn't need to see the wreckage again. The memory of the mangled brass and shattered glass was burned behind my eyes. I walked down the hall, my footsteps the only sound, and descended the 3 flights of stairs. My hand slid along the cool, smooth metal of the banister. The building's front door clicked open and I stepped out onto the street. The sun hit my face. It was warm, real. I closed my eyes for a second, just feeling it. The air smelled of car exhaust and hot pavement, the familiar scent of the city in the morning. A horn blared 2 blocks away. A bicycle bell chimed as someone rode past me on the sidewalk. My car was parked at the end of the block. I started walking toward it. My plan was simple. Get in the car, drive to Sarah's, pack a bag. Then, we would go somewhere, anywhere for a week. A beach, a cabin in the mountains, a place with no old books, no dark hallways, no memories. My muscles ached with a deep, settled soreness. A physical price for a battle won. Ahead of me, on the cracked concrete of the sidewalk, a small child was playing. A boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, wearing a baseball cap sideways. He was bouncing a rubber ball against the brick wall of a laundromat. The ball was bright red. It made a steady, rhythmic thud-thud-thud against the bricks. A sound so normal it made my chest loosen. He missed a catch, and the red ball bounced away from him, rolling in a lazy arc toward the street. I watched it go. The simple physics of it were reassuring. I walked past him, my keys already in my hand, jingling softly. A step. Then, another. The sound of the bouncing stopped. A small prickle of awareness made me turn my head, just to glance over my shoulder. The boy had retrieved his ball. He was holding it in both hands, getting ready to throw it again. The ball was purple. A deep, solid grape color. I stopped walking. My feet were cemented to the sidewalk. I turned my whole body around to look. It was purple. There was no question. Not lavender, not maroon. Purple. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The color did not change. The boy threw the purple ball against the wall. Thud. He caught it. Thud. He caught it again. I told myself it was the light. The sun in my eyes. The exhaustion. I'd been awake for almost 2 days, running on adrenaline and fear. Of course my eyes were playing tricks on me. A child's ball. It was nothing. I turned back toward my car. I took a breath. I forced my legs to move. Left foot. Right foot. The prickling feeling did not go away. It spread from the back of my neck down my arms. My car was 50 feet away. Between it and me was a bus stop. A simple bench with a shelter of green-tinted plexiglass. On the back wall of the shelter was a large advertisement. I remembered it from when I'd arrived days ago. A woman with a cascade of shiny blonde hair, smiling, holding a bottle of shampoo. A landmark of the mundane. I kept my eyes on my car, on the familiar dent in the rear bumper. I did not want to look at the ad. But my head turned, a motion I couldn't seem to control. The poster showed a woman. She was smiling, holding the bottle of shampoo. Her hair was the color of fresh lawn clippings. A bright, impossible green. It wasn't a punk dye job, streaked or faded. It was perfect. Every strand of vivid, uniform Kelly green, cascading over her shoulders like a plastic wig. I felt my stomach clench. It was a cold knot, low in my gut. I looked away. I stared at the ground. I focused on the cracks in the pavement, a dark line of weeds growing through one of them. I was at the intersection. I had to cross the street to get to my car. I looked up. The sign at the corner was an octagon. It had the 4 letters on it. STOP. But the sign was not red. It was the color of a construction cone, a flat, bright orange. I stood there, a few feet from the curb. My heart was a hammer inside my ribs. A car came down the street, slowed at the orange sign, and then continued through the intersection. The driver did not seem to notice. No one seemed to notice. This was worse than the shifting rooms. In the apartment, the horror was contained. It was a private war. This was the world. This was daylight. My hand went to my pocket, searching for my phone. My fingers felt clumsy, thick. The phone vibrated as I pulled it out. The screen was lit up. A string of notifications. From a news app. Backquote. Breaking. Mayor announces _82 Shawl and Carrot New Park Initiative. Backquote. From my email. Backquote subject. Forwarded message. Your quarterly. KS%% J9-SLAT. Backquote. From a weather app. Backquote forecast. High of 74. Winds from the 91 WST. Backquote. The characters were a meaningless scramble. A clean, digital corruption. I shoved the phone back into my pocket, the screen scraping against the denim. The movement was jerky. Too fast. I just wanted to get to my car. To get inside, lock the doors, and drive. Drive until the signs were red again. A siren started in the distance. A thin, rising wail. It cut through the city noise. It grew louder, closer. It was a sound I knew. A sound of order, of help. A fire engine or an ambulance. Something real. Something that responded to emergencies. I looked down the street, my eyes scanning past the rows of parked cars. The sound was a hook, pulling my attention. For a second, the knot in my stomach loosened. A fire engine. It would be red. Of course it would be red. It had to be. It was a rule. It came around a corner 3 blocks down, moving fast. A large truck, clearing a path for itself. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Help was on its way. Not for me, but it was out there. The system was still working. But as it barreled closer, my blood went cold. The relief turned to ice in my veins. It wasn't red. The entire machine, from the front bumper to the rear chassis, was a brilliant, polished cobalt blue. It was the color of a deep ocean, of a bottle of ink. It reflected the morning sun in long, shimmering streaks along its side. The ladders, the hoses, the chrome railings, they were all mounted against this impossible blue. It looked like a child's toy, scaled up and given a monstrous life. The siren wailed, the same sound as ever, but the light on its roof was a nightmare. It wasn't red. It wasn't blue or white. The spinning light was a cube of pure black. It didn't flash. It revolved. It didn't cast light. It seemed to punch a hole in it. Each time the black rectangle faced me, it swallowed the sunlight, creating a momentary void, a flicker of non-existence. It spun with a hypnotizing rhythm. Black, light, black, light. It roared past me. The force of its passage was a physical blow, a rush of wind that smelled of diesel and something else, something like burnt sugar. I saw the figures inside the cab, dark shapes behind the glass, their faces turned forward. They were just going to work. Putting out a fire. In their blue truck. I stood on the corner, unable to move, and watched it recede down the street until it turned and vanished, its siren fading into the background hum of the city. I was alone again. I looked around. A woman pushed a stroller past me, talking on her phone. A man in a suit unlocked a shop door across the street. No one was screaming. No one was pointing. No one else saw. Or they saw, and they thought a fire engine was supposed to be blue. My gaze drifted upward, past the orange stop sign, past the brick buildings and water towers. I looked at the sky. The sun was a bright white disk. But around it, where the blue of the sky should have been clearest, was a faint but distinct halo, a shimmering, sickly ring of pale green. The understanding came then, not in a rush, but as a slow, heavy certainty that settled into my bones. The sextant. It hadn't been a source of power. It hadn't been a weapon. It was an anchor, a cage, a small, defined space where the thing could be contained, where its influence was limited to one man's study, one man's apartment. I had smashed the cage. In my desperation, in my moment of perceived triumph, I had taken a chisel to the prison walls. I had shattered the lock. The shriek I'd heard when the sextant broke wasn't a death cry. It was the sound of a door being kicked open. I hadn't killed it. I had set it free. The corrections were no longer confined to the dusty rooms of my father's apartment. The process had spilled out. It was seeping into the world, starting with the small things. The color of a ball. The color of a woman's hair in a picture. The color of a stop sign. And it was scaling up. A fire engine. The sky itself. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't a punishment. It was just rewriting the source code, one line at a time, replacing a world it didn't understand with its own flawed, awful version. I stood there, under a jaundiced sun, my car keys growing heavy in my hand. I had tried to save myself from the nightmare in the apartment, but I had just unleashed it on everyone. I hadn't saved anyone. I had doomed them all.